All right, we still have a few people trickling in, but respecting everyone's time, let's go ahead and get started. And for anybody that joins me a few minutes late, this session will be recorded and available after as well. So welcome everybody, happy November. My name is Matt Palmer. I am the product evangelist here at Enrollment RX. I've met many of you, but if I have not personally, it's nice to be speaking with you guys today. We're really excited about our topic today, which is kind of the hot item in the Salesforce world, which is flow. So this is really just kind of an introduction into what is flow, what does it mean, why are we even talking about it? But most importantly, we have a flow master in Stephanie Stoddard from St. Joseph's College joining us today. So before we get into our agenda, I'm going to let my colleague Anthony and Stephanie introduce themselves as well.
Hi, hello everyone. You may have met me before, whether through project work or through tickets, but my name is Anthony Casanova, implementation consultant at Enrollment RX. Looking forward to walking you guys through building a flow together. So, and here's Steph.
Hello, I'm Stephanie Stoddard. I work at St. Joseph's College of Maine, just outside of Portland. I've been with the college for a couple of years, and I've been a Salesforce accidental admin for about 4 years. When I first started, I had a Latin American studies background, and now as Matt so kindly introduced me, I am very comfortable in the Salesforce world and with Flow. So if I can do it, anyone can do it. And hopefully this webinar will help everyone feel slightly more comfortable with using Flow and some of these automation tools.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie and Anthony. And we're certainly excited to get started. Just before we get into the agenda, one thing we want to know, we did schedule about an hour and a half for today's session. So it will be recorded. We know you all have busy lives with school schedules and things like that. So if you have to drop off for some reason, it will be recorded and we'll share that after. But we also wanted to allow enough time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions and answers, we ask that you use the Q&A chat box versus just the chat. So that way we can make sure we get to all those. And even if we can't get to it at the end, we have a record of all those so we can follow up with you accordingly. So I just want to make that quick note and announcement. But with that, let's go ahead and jump into our agenda. All right, so our agenda for today is a little bit about Enrollment RX. So I know most of you are current clients and work with us already, but we do have a few guests here today as well. So just a quick overview of that, but really walking through what is Salesforce and why does it matter? Walk through a common example of a workflow. So Anthony is going to kind of walk you through essentially just a common workflow that you currently might use as an ERX client and kind of how to rebuild that in a flow. And then Stephanie is going to walk us through 3 examples of different types of flows and use cases she's used at St. Joseph's College. She has many more than that, but we did limit these to the probably 3 most impactful for their business processes today, with the hopes that, as an institution, you can walk away with this with some ideas and ways that you can enhance your business process. And then we're going to talk a little bit about best practices as you look into flows. We'll have some time for Q&A, and then also resources. So if you're not familiar with Trailhead, Trailhead is the Salesforce learning platform, and we have some really good recommended trails to get you started. So even after this webinar today, if you've never built a flow before in your life, you could do that in a sandbox through Trailhead and get started. So just real quick about Enrollment RX. So what is Enrollment RX? We like to say we're the RAD solution, which means that we focus on recruitment, admissions, and decisions in Salesforce. So these are all the different kind of elements that we can integrate with related to Salesforce and provide some out-of-the-box solutions for higher education institutions. So as part of that, we have, focusing on recruitment from things from inquiry touch points to the application portal, assignment manager, checklist requirements, communications, and so forth. So if you would like to learn some more about that, if you're our guest with us today, feel free to reach out, and I'm sure our team would be happy to share a little bit more. But as we jump into flow, the first question might be, well, what is flow? Maybe you've heard this term multiple times, but you have no idea what it is. You might also be someone on this call who's built 100 of them, right? So we might have the scale here. But a flow is just an automation tool that allows for the creation of complex business processes. So right now, we had a webinar about a year ago, actually, on different types of automations. And if you attended that, flow was part of that conversation. So we actually talked about things related to what is called a workflow in Salesforce, a process builder in Salesforce. And those are more the legacy kind of commonly used automations in Salesforce. So if you need to make a field update or send an email or do a lot of these different kind of automation features, Salesforce has made it very clear, especially as recently, that the future of all of that is now going to be in flow. I've even read some things, even though this is not quote confirmed, that even in next year, Salesforce will basically eventually stop allowing you to build new workflows or process builders. So this is something that definitely needs to be learned, and they have continued to enhance flow over and over and over with every Salesforce release to really be on par, if not better, than some of those existing legacy tools. Now, the bad news, of course, of that is, all right, well, now I got to learn flow if I've just learned how to build process builders. But there is some really good news tied into that. And the good news tied into that is basically the efficiency of a flow versus some of the legacy automations. So I almost think of flows as very surgical, meaning that it's going to do exactly what it needs to do and not necessarily more than that. If you don't know, Salesforce has limits, right, to how many transactions when a record fires or saves. And if too many are happening at once, if you use Salesforce for a while, you might run into something called a CPU timeout error, because there are limits to how many transaction and the consumption of DML operation in that transaction. And so, without getting too technical, the takeaway is that flows are just a lot more efficient overall and allow for you to really, I would say, condense some of your existing automations as well. So if we go into what's called the order of operations in Salesforce, I'm not going to go super deep dive on this, but just to give you a visual, when you load a record, whether that record is, updated or created, let's pretend it's a contact record for a second, it's going to go through all these steps here, all the way down to what's called an intermediate save. So it kind of checks all these things. Are there duplicate rules? Is there custom validation? And then it makes this kind of intermediate save of the record and then runs through these other processes as well. All the way over here, you have, process builder, right? So any sort of process builder, if you use process builder before, it goes all the way through all of these, checks here, if the record updates, and then it'll run all the way back through again. So it can kind of get into this kind of cyclical process where it's consuming what I talked about earlier, some of those DML kind of operations. So it's not maybe as efficient, right, as a flow. Now, if we look at what's called a before save flow and an after save flow, which is what Stephanie and Anthony will take a deeper dive on. If I go here, the before save flow, which common examples of that are like if you have an update on the same object and you're just updating a related field. So Anthony is going to walk through an example of that. That is happening here. So it's not going through all this stuff and then retriggering again. It's inserting before the intermediate save and then just making that update. So it's much, much more efficient. Now, a after save flow, which common examples of that is if you're going cross object, which is similar to process builder. So you have a contact change updating the related application as an example. An after trigger flow would happen here, but as you can see, it's still much earlier in the process than kind of the traditional kind of process builder here. There's actually a great article on the Salesforce Architect site where they did an in-depth analysis on existing processes, things like process builders and workflows as compared to a flow. And as you can see here, without getting like overly technical, you can see the overhead in milliseconds of a before save flow right here an after and a process builder, right? Or even an after save flow in a process builder. So these are greatly reducing, especially if multiple operations happening, which is quite common, and making your system run more efficiently. So the takeaway outside of the technical is that flows are much more surgical and they work very, very well in making your processes more efficient. So that's the good news in kind of these transitions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Anthony, and he's going to start sharing and walking us through a few examples of this.
Sounds good. Once you stop sharing, yep. All right, I just want to confirm, Matt, we can see my screen, the slideshow?
Yes.
Cool, perfect. So, sorry. Moving on to the next slide. As Matt was mentioning, we're going to build a flow together. You all may have a similarly named flow in your org right now, but we call this one the admissions document update display name. And this is going to be, as Matt said, a record triggered before save flow. And what does this do? So what this flow does is it'll update the portal display name of an admissions document dynamically upon the creation of it, if that portal display name is null, right? So just to give you a little bit of background for the non-Enrollment RX clients, we have internal records that we sometimes display on the outside facing candidate portal, and we have the ability to have a separate naming convention for it. Now, this automation is helping us as admins, as users, to ensure that we always have a document with a name that the student can see, right? And furthermore, we can easily expand that to have more things such as like Anthony's essay, for an example. But let us go, without further ado, jump into Salesforce. So you may be familiar with the screen. This is the backend setup menu. If we don't know how to get there, you'd navigate to your gear icon and click the setup menu. Right? And once we're here, we would want to go in the search bar to look for a flow. Now we can look on the top bar, or we can go ahead and search for flow on the left-hand side. If we look in the left-hand side, we'll see that flow lives under a category called process automation. That's the same category where we have our workflow rules and our actions. So before we dive into it, I want to help y'all understand that flows are not necessarily that much harder than workflow rules. And as I build them, I'm going to keep bouncing back to the original workflow rule that I created and draw a lot of parallels when we're creating such flow. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to click into flow. We'll see that we have a list view with all the flows that we have. We have the ability to create list views to organize that, but that's not why we're here today. So let's go ahead and create a new flow. When we push the new flow button, we are presented a lot of different options. The most similar flow to a workflow rule is going to be called record triggered. And if we read the description, we'll see that this flow launches when a record's created, updated, or deleted, and it runs in the background. When I click next, we have an option to choose how do we want to start building this thing. So if you're used to doing flows in the past, you're pretty much used to using freeform, where essentially you have to drag elements on the screen and you have to connect them. But I personally love the auto layout because it, as Salesforce mentions, it automatically positions all elements and connectors for you. So when I click the auto layout, it brings me right into the action, right? So first and foremost, we want to know what object is this going to be running off of. I had mentioned before, this is an admissions document flow. So we're going to go ahead and start searching for admissions document. You'll see that we have the label of the object and the API below. And then it asks us, when do we want to have this flow fire? Okay, this may be very familiar to a workflow rule, right? Because when you're doing a workflow rule, you get to ask when you want criteria evaluated, when it's created, edited, or subsequently edited, right? So very similar here. In our situation, we would want this to be when the record is created or edited. Okay, and now we have that defined, we'll put some entry criteria. Like, we don't want this flow to fire every time somebody creates or saves a record, right? Because that's inefficient, that's not what we want. So we are going to set a condition very similar to as if we were doing a workflow rule. Now, what is this condition going to be? So I had mentioned that we have a secondary field that we use to display to the applicant. It's the portal name field. So I only want this flow to fire when that field's blank. So what do I do here? I find the field object on the left and I will search for the portal name field. You'll see that when you start typing, it'll query either the API of a field or it'll query the label of the field. Kind of helps you as a user figure out which field you want. So we're going to choose this when the portal name is blank. Now, normally we would just, maybe get used to leaving it blank, but when we're using Flow, we have to utilize what's called a global constant. If we're trying to have this fire when the field is blank, we'll use the global constant of empty string. If we were doing something like a checkbox Boolean field where it's true or false, we would respectively choose true or false. Okay. If this was a little bit more complex, and if we wanted to add a couple criteria, we can certainly push the add condition button, throw some more on there. We could customize the logic. Again, very similar to as if we were doing a workflow. And then we are asked when we want to run the flow, right? Now, this is really important. We want to make sure that, for my example, I want to make sure that this only fires when the conditions are met once, right? I don't want this to constantly be firing, and that is why I'm going to choose the second option. And then down to the meat of it, right? Matt was explaining to us the benefits of using a fast field update whenever we possibly can. In my situation, the change that I'm making on a record is going to be updating the same record. So that's why I want to choose fast field update. It's going to make it that much more efficient. If I were to do other related actions, I would choose this one, but it would be an after save flow. So for the purposes of the demo, I'm going to choose fast field updates and click done. Forgot to clear these out. Okay, and we're gonna click done. So now we are presented our flow. And the first thing that I like to do is just save it, right? Because if you were to navigate away, you're gonna lose all your progress. So we'll call this admissions document demo flow. There's an option to choose, to add a description. I would highly suggest that you do that for every flow that you do, right? This will update the Great. So it's going to give you a warning, but that's just because we haven't actually done anything with the flow. That makes sense. So to recap, right, we created the flow, we set some conditions, and we decided how we want this to be optimized. And this is for fast field updates. So now we want to do something. So how do we do that? We have this lovely plus icon on the bottom if you're using the auto layout. Otherwise, you'd have to go drag elements onto the screen. So if you push the plus icon, we are going to see there's a lot of different options here, right? You can do fancier stuff with logic. That's stuff that Stephanie will probably highlight in her videos. Also, we have the data section, right, which has the actions that we want to do, right? We want to update a record based off this flow being fired. So I'm going to choose it. When I choose update records, I get a screen, right? And usually this comparison would be similar to your immediate workflow actions, right? Where you define your criteria to enter an automation, and now you're defining what you want the automation to do. So I'm just going to do update display name. Again, description if you need it. Now you'll see below here, we have some options, but they're actually grayed out. And I'm just going to go ahead and walk through this really quick. When you're doing a record update and you're doing a before save flow, and you're only updating the record that started the flow, right? You only have this first option. Use the admissions document record that started the flow. If we did an after save flow, which again, it accesses different parts of the Salesforce org, we'd have other options to pick, okay, well, what other related object do we want to pick, right? But again, for this simple flow, let's just go ahead and rock with it. Additionally, when we're updating the records, we have a second chance to set more filter criteria. It's a little bit complex. We're just going to say no, because again, we already set the criteria in the start of our flow. So we don't need to have another criteria in there. Okay. So again, I mentioned that this flow is going to fire if a record's created or updated and the display name is blank. Okay. So now what do we want to happen? We want to fill the display name with a document name of the attachment. Okay, so in this update, I'm setting what field values I want to set. So I'm going to find my display name, and I'm going to have it equal a document name dynamically. Now, when you're, okay, so before I go any further, I'm just going to show you really quick what this looks like on the back end, just to give you a visual if you're not really familiar with our object model. if I were to go ahead and find my admissions document object, create a new record, this is what I'm talking about. We have a document name, which generally categorizes what an admissions document is. And I want this automation to take this name and fill it in the display name if I leave the record blank, right? Just to give you a visual of what this pick list looks like, so that when I go back to the flow and I'm defining this portal name, let's see here, you have a lot of options. Don't get overwhelmed. When you're trying to have a field from the record that you're updating be referenced, you'll see that we have a global variable called record and record prior. Do not do record prior unless you know what you're doing. It's for more advanced automations. We're going to go dive into our record and find the document name field. You can start typing in and it'll start querying the fields. I'm sorry, there you go. All right, very good. So now we're defining that our portal name is going to equal our document name, right? And that's it. So we'll just go ahead, save our flow. You'll see that the error message that we had before is no longer there because it's passed all of these Salesforce checks to make sure that it works. And once you save it, you want to make sure that you activate the flow so you can have it run. So before I do that, though, I'm going to deactivate it and show you what happens when we do not have the flow active. And then I'll show you what happens after we turn it back on. Okay, so I'm creating an admissions document. I'm leaving my portal name blank, but I have a document name. And right now, without the automation active, that portal name is going to be blank. I keep saying portal name, it's display name. If I were to go ahead to my process builder that we just created, activate it, you'll see that now when I go ahead and create a new admissions document, and I fill in a document name, leave the rest blank, go find my record, you'll see that the display name is now updated to be the document name. And that's an example of how you can dynamically access a field on your record, the record that caused the automation to fire, and use fields on there to populate another field. So earlier, I had mentioned that this could easily be expanded to include text such as like the candidate's name in front of the field. So in order to do that, I mean, it gets a little bit more complicated, but essentially you could create a resource on the left-hand side. And again, I'm only going through this because we have a little bit extra time. So if you were to create a resource, we're going to call this a variable. Okay. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to show you an example of where I have this already. Sorry, apologize. We're going to skip through that. We're going to actually go on to the next section of this of my presentation. I'm just going to walk you through an after save flow example. In this after save flow example, it contains the formula field I was trying to reference, right? So let us, before we continue, I want to talk about what I'm going to be showing you, right? So in this after save flow, it's called admission status updates. And what it does is it performs various updates such as task creations, emails, field updates, all depending on the advancement of a student's admission status. You know, if you go from inquiry to started app to completed app. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. Here we go. Okay. Now this looks a little bit more complicated than the one I was just showing you. However, as you're building them, you're going to start to be able to look at this and digest it. We have a element that I was referencing before, right? On the left-hand side, we have resources we can create. We have a decision element that guides the whole flow, such that if we're in inquiry, we go down one path. If we're started app, we go down that path, so on and so forth. And what's really cool is, you know, in the past, you might have created 5 different workflows to achieve the same thing, right? One for inquiry, one for started app. But as you're starting to get more comfortable with flow, you can start expanding how you architect things. And that way you have less automations firing at once. And just to show you a little bit of highlight of some of the things that flow can do, there's an email element that you can use, right? You could leverage existing workflow email rules and inject them in the flow. You can also do fun stuff like creating tasks for an app owner. And when you create a task, you have the option to set individual field values for it as well. And yeah, I believe that should be all I want to go over right now. I don't want to get too into this because it's a little bit much, but I think that's the end of my section. So I believe I'm ready to hand it off.
Great, thanks, Anthony. Let me set this up here. All right, with that, we're going to kind of transition over to Stephanie. Pull this up. And Stephanie, maybe you can just kind of start to walk us through, and thank you, Anthony, for those kind of updates you provided there. Let me go here. And Stephanie, go ahead and take it away, and kind of we can walk through some of the configurations you've done at St. Joseph's.
Okay, great, thank you. So the first flow that I'm going to talk about is a Screenflow. And what a Screenflow allows is user input on kind of the user side of Salesforce. So I set up a flow and allow user input to determine what happens within the flow. And the demo will show exactly how that works. But the reason for this particular flow is sometimes an applicant will come in with a couple different email addresses, a school email or a personal email, and there's some confusion over which email can they use to log in to actually continue with their application. So this Screenflow allows our counselors to be able to update someone's portal email address if their contact email address has changed. And so this allows me to step back and allows the counselors to be able to help troubleshoot login issues. So it's a lot more efficient for our counselors to be able to do that. And we will show you how that works. The update user email flow allows us to sync the email address from a contact record to the email address and username of the portal account, which I have displayed here on the contact. So this is an inquiry that is getting ready to apply. You can see they have used their school email address, the .edu, as their initial inquiry, and that is what is associated with their current portal user. As an applicant, I can still go in and update my email address in my application. So this is me logged in as a student. I can go down here to the bottom to the email address field, and I can change it to my personal email address, which will change it only on the contact record. So if I change it to personal@test.com, for example, and I click save, this will save the email address change for the contact record, which will just take a minute here. And once it saves here in my application, then when I log back into Salesforce as the counselor, I can then see the email address change to be the personal email address. So I just refresh the screen. You can see here the email address is now personal@test.com. However, if I look over here on the right-hand side under my portal account details, I can see that I still have the school email address as the email and username for my account, and that can get confusing. So this user update Screenflow allows for the counselor who may not have access to editing the user directly to be able to update the email address from the contact record once the contact has been changed and sync the community user. So here are the instructions for the Screenflow, which I embedded right here on the contact record. If the applicant's email address is changed, click Next to update the applicant's portal email address and username. So note that the username is the same as the email address. If the username is already associated with the user, you will be unable to update the email or username because across Salesforce, the username must be unique across all users. And it will be prompted to submit an iTeam ticket, which is our internal IT ticketing system. So instead of having the counselor, if they encounter an issue, instead of having them submit a separate ticket, they can do it right through the Screenflow. So I'll click next, and then it says it was successfully updated. I'll click finish, and then I will refresh the screen. Sometimes it takes a minute for this community user detail to update. So I just clicked refresh. And so now you can see that the account ID, which is the username, and the account email have now changed to be the same as the contact record. So it's changed to the portal email. So now anytime the applicant goes to log in, they will use their personal email address with their existing password. And if they need to reset the password, that's the email that's associated with their account. So let's take a look at what this flow looks like. So I'll scroll down to the Screenflow, open that. So the Screenflow is what allows me to put the flow right here, and the Screenflow allows it to be user driven rather than automatically update. So the first thing that I do is I get the contact record, and that's what allows me to put the flow right onto the contact record and allows the flow to know what contact we are working with. So it actually takes the contact ID directly from the contact page that it's on, so I don't have to worry about updating an incorrect contact. The first thing that I bring after I get the contact record is the Screenflow that prompts the user, in this case, this counselor, and gives them this information and allows them to click next. That's what this first Screenflow does, and it's just text that I've typed in here. After that, you do a get user record, which finds the existing portal user that's associated with the contact. In this case, I have put it right here onto the contact record so that the counselors can easily see if the user's email address and username are already synced with the contact record or if they are different. And that allows the counselor to troubleshoot a little bit any login issues that an applicant may be having. And then this next is an update. So I pull over an update record, and I'm updating the email address for this user record right here that I just grabbed. So I'm updating the username and the email address in one update. So it's right here, and it's just pulling from this contact record, it's just pulling the email address. So now I have two branches. So the first branch is what we saw, is the success screen, and just says, yep, it was successfully updated. However, what sometimes might happen is the username might already exist with a different user. Sometimes an applicant will create a login using their school email address and then create one using their personal email address, not realizing they could just use the same application. So sometimes they might get an error. The error would tell them that they cannot change the username and the email address, and it gives them the option to submit an iTeam ticket, which would send an email to me, and I would receive an IT ticket to troubleshoot the issue. The submission is not a requirement, so there's a decision element. So if they do check the box to send a ticket, it will automatically send an email, and it will display a screen saying the email was sent, someone will be in contact with you shortly. Or if they do not check the checkbox to send the ticket, then the screen will say you didn't send an email. You can go back if you need to send the email, or you can click finish and return to the contact page. Okay, so that was an example of a Screenflow. It had many similar elements to what Anthony had demonstrated. And also you noticed there were some additional elements that we could use in the Screenflow and access different parts of Salesforce and additional user-driven parts of the flow automation. So this next automation that I've created is a before save record update, like what Anthony had demonstrated with his display name update. This before save flow updates a few more fields from another system. So we have an integration with our Salesforce instance with FrontRush, which is what our athletics department uses to track all of their recruits. And the requirement was to connect the two systems so that the coaches and the admissions counselors kind of know what's going on in terms of who coaches are talking to, who counselors are talking to. And so this flow pulls in all of the information from FrontRush and then kind of massages the data and before it actually saves the record into Salesforce for the admissions counselors to use. So it helps preserve data integrity and make sure that all of the data aligns with what our counselors need. So this demo will show a little bit more about that flow.
This is an example of a contact record that was updated by our before save flow. We use FrontRush for our athletics department where they capture prospect information and their current athlete information. We have an integration that brings all the prospect data into Salesforce for our admissions team, and it also pushes the admissions inquiry data over into FrontRush, so there's more clarity between the coaches and the admissions team. Some of the data that gets updated in our before save flow include the name to make it so that it's capitalized correctly. We also update the address to make sure that the 0 isn't dropped on the zip code, for example, and to make sure that the address details match what the admissions team needs for an address. Sometimes it'll even mark it if it's an incomplete address. Sometimes the coach will only have the city, or sometimes they'll only have the mail street, and sometimes that's not enough information for the admissions team. The admissions team also uses the zip code for record assignment, so that's an important detail. So it helps with the data integrity that's coming in between systems. It'll also update the term and year of entry or the anticipated graduation year, depending on if the coaches have that information, which they generally do. Sometimes they'll even have the high school, so we'll send that over. The other big piece that we pull over is from FrontRush, we get the sport name, we'll have the ID, any notes that the coach might enter, the priority level, if it's someone they're really actively recruiting or if it's someone that's expressed interest in the sport. And we will update this admission sports field based on what data we get from FrontRush. So this is a lookup field to an account where we house all of our sports, and it will update for our admissions team so they can see and report on sports, and it will update the coach's name here as well, and sometimes we have additional information. So this is a FrontRush before save updated contact record. So let's take a look at the flow. So this is the before save flow. This is how it's triggered, is so we know that it's a FrontRush, and we have some other criteria in here, but it's a fast field update, so it's a before save, which is helpful for our admissions team, so the data gets updated before it even touches our database. So what we have here are decision elements which decide if the record actually needs to be updated for a given criteria. We have online and on-campus divisions. So first thing we need to do is identify it as an on-campus record. All athletes are on-campus students. Then our next decision is to check the mailing address. So again, as I was saying, sometimes we don't have a full address that comes over from FrontRush. So the admissions team has a flag on if it's an incomplete address, and we will set that flag if the admissions team doesn't have enough information to have a complete address for mailing, for example. We'll also make sure that the zip code is updated correctly, because as I stated, that's the zip code is how the admissions team assigns records. So it's a very important field for the team. So I make sure that the zip code comes in correctly, or not at all if it's, only 3 digits, for example. And this last piece down here is to update that sports field on the contact record based on the information that we get from Front Rush. So sometimes the Front Rush sports are named differently than how they are in Salesforce. For example, Front Rush labels basketball as just basketball, but here in Salesforce we have women's basketball and men's basketball. So we use some logic in here to identify if it needs to be the men's basketball account or the women's basketball account. And then we actually look for the account record here. And then we get the account record, we get the ID, and we pass the ID into our contact record, which updates it. And it's actually these assignment variables right here that will do the updating on the contact record. So it makes for a very clean and efficient way to ensure data integrity between systems that aren't connected.
Right, and that was a slightly more detailed example of a before save flow. But this next flow is called the OLC INC app flow. So basically what this flow does, it's an auto launch flow that is actually currently triggered from Process Builder, which obviously that will be changing. But what this flow does is it handles our incomplete application communications for our online division. They have a whole series of defined communications that they want to go out. And because it's a consistent process that they have, they wanted to automate it. So it's over the course of 90 days. They have different tasks and emails that happen, which this video will demonstrate. But it helps take away some of the manual process from the counselor and automate that for them. So let's take a look at the demo.
This application is an incomplete application for our online division. This application will utilize the 90-day incomplete application flow that is automatically triggered once the application is marked in incomplete application status, as is indicated here. It also relies on the date stamp, which is right here, so the date that the application was marked incomplete. Our online division has a 90-day cycle of communications that the counselor will complete to help this applicant complete their application. So over here on the right, you can see that the first task that the counselor has is this phone call, day 1. So throughout the automation, the counselor will either receive a task that a phone call is due, sometimes a text is due, and sometimes the automation will automatically send out an email directly to the applicant, and it will create a task that's already completed, just notifying the counselor that the email was sent with the due date of when the email was actually sent. So the flow itself looks very complicated, looks very overwhelming. However, it is just a series of steps that are repeated over and over again on the given days defined for the incomplete application communication. So let's take a look at the flow. So this is the flow. It has, as I said, many different pieces, but it starts with just getting the information from the application. From the application, it goes on to create that first record, which is this incomplete app phone call. That's always completed on the day that the application is marked incomplete based on that date stamp. From there, it goes to this pause element. So this pause element is really kind of the central hub. You can see it's located right in the center of this kind of spiral. So this pause element is really the key that after any, days actions have been completed, it goes back to this pause element. And it is this pause element that tells the automation what to do and when to do it. So after this first task is given, the next one isn't until 10 days after the application is marked incomplete. And that's what this pause does. You give the pause certain conditions. You tell it, 10 days from when the application is marked incomplete, I want the next thing to happen. So you tell it when to pause, and then you have this resume event. So you tell it when to resume and do the next set of tasks or email or whatever it is that you need it to do. So what I'm telling it is from the application, from the date incomplete, 10 days later, I want it to do whatever it is. So then I find the day 10, I can see I'm telling it to just double check that the application is actually still in incomplete application. If it's a complete application or if they've been admitted already, then I need to know that, because we don't want to send an email or have the counselor call an applicant expecting to talk about an incomplete application and find out that they've already completed it. So the first thing I do is make sure it's still incomplete. And if it is, it sends an email automatically. It creates a task for the counselor to call the applicant in this case. And then it goes back to the pause. And it repeats again for day 20, day 30, 40, 45, 50, and so on, all the way up through day 90. Interspersed and throughout is if the online division needs to update this for whatever reason, or something happens and an application gets missed for whatever reason, then there are kind of checks in place that I can restart applications at whatever day they should be at. So there's also kind of a fail-safe to be able to update this automation for our online division. And so this is one of the ways that Flow can be very versatile and can be adapted for any use case. And while this looks super complicated, we're actually going to break it down and see how we can do just a very simple auto-launched flow for a phone call after 10 days. So let's go ahead and start that together. So I'm going to go to Flow, and I am actually going to create a new flow. We are going to do an auto-launch flow. In this case, this incomplete application flow is launched from a process builder at the moment. There are many different ways to launch flows. You can do a record trigger. You can, from a process, from Apex code. There's many different ways from a record Lightning page. You can launch flows. But for now, we're just going to do auto-launched, no trigger. And I'm going to do freeform. It just gives me more flexibility in where I put things on my canvas. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I need to know what record I'm working with. So I'm going to do a get record element. I'm going to drag it over onto the canvas, and I'm going to label it as get app record. It's always a good idea to put in a description, because if somebody else is looking at it, if you need support or have somebody else take a look at it, it's helpful to label a description in all of your elements so it gets the current app record. So the object I'm looking for is the application, and I'm going to scroll down to here we are, the Enrollment RX application object, which is what we use. And I'm going to filter for the ID of the current record, and I'm going to assign a variable called record ID. And this can be used, it's a Salesforce record ID resource that can be used in many different ways. I won't go into that, but you can use it to pass a records ID into an automation, and the automation will kind of know that it's a special use case for the record ID. So I'm just going to, again, description is applications record ID, and the data type I want is a text. Leave everything else the same, click done. And then I only want the first record. It's only this one record that I want, and I want all of the fields because I don't know what fields I might be using in my automation. So I'm just going to have it store all of them. And I'm going to connect this to my start element. So this is where my flow is going to start automatically, is on this get app record. And then I'm going to save it, just label it incomplete app flow, give it a description, handles incomplete applications, application communications. And then I'm going to click save. And now it's all saved. So after my get record, now that I have all the application details, I can say, okay, after 10 days, I want it to do X, Y, and Z. So the first thing I need to do is tell the flow that I want it to pause. So I want to say 10-day pause is the name of this pause element. Pause the automation after 10 days. So this, I'm going to just label this configuration. So this is the when I want it to pause and when I want it to resume. So these are the criteria that I'm going to give. So I'm going to say 10 days is what I'm going to label it. In this case, because I want to only deal with my online division, I don't want my on-campus division to be part of this flow, I am going to say all conditions are met. That's when I want this to pause. And of course, on-campus applications won't even make it into the flow because on my process builder, when I trigger this flow to run, on-campus will automatically be filtered out. But just as kind of a redundancy, I'm going to add in some additional pause conditions. I'm going to say the application, from the application record that I had already retrieved and stored all of the information in here, I'm going to go to my division field, equals, and then in here, I can just type in online. So now I'm definitely filtering only my online applications. And I'm going to say that the date that the application was marked incomplete is less than or equal to, and then this is when I'm going to create a formula to say I want it to be 10 days, and then I want it to be date. So this, I changed to 10 days formula. So check when is 10 days from today. So my formula is, because I want my date the incomplete app was marked, I want it to be today minus 10. I want it to be within these 10 days from today. And I'm going to click the resume event up here. When do I want this flow to resume? I'm going to say I want it to be a specific record field. So now I'm going to do the API name of the object, and it tells you right here what exactly you need to put in here. And enrollment opportunity. Actually, it's in there. Should be RX here. The field I want it to be based on is the date incomplete app. And if you don't know the API names off the top of your head, you can just go into your object manager, find the object that you're working with, and you can do a copy and paste from the object for the object API name, or you can go into fields and relationships and get the field API name. This unfortunately is a type one that you have to type, so copying and pasting is generally a good way to ensure that you're getting the correct one. And then you look, it's asking what's the record ID that's triggering it, and it's this record ID that I grabbed at the very beginning of my flow. The offset number is kind of when, so 10 and then days, because I want it to resume 10 days from this date incomplete app. And then this part down here is optional, and I won't get into that right now. So for now, I'm just going to hit done. So now I have my pause element. I'm going to say, right after I get the record details, I'm going to pause my flow, and I just like my arrows nice and straight. Then I'll click save. You want to keep, so it's not letting me save because I don't have anything connected. After my pause, like what is it going to do? So right after my pause, I'm going to say, okay, I want to just double check that the application still is in fact incomplete. So I'm going to do another get record. I'm going to label it get 10-day app. I'm going to look for my application. I'm going to describe checks incomplete app after 10 days, because a lot can happen in 10 days. An application can even be admitted after 10 days. So I'm just going to check that the application is still incomplete. So I'm going to say that the ID is this record ID from the very beginning. So that's the record that I want to look at. So again, I'm doing kind of the same get record again. So again, it's just a repeat. So, and then I'm connecting it to my pause element. So I'm saying after my 10-day pause happens, the next thing that I immediately want to do is check my record and make sure that it's still an incomplete application. And then I want to decide what happens if it is. Okay, so I'm going to say app 10-day decision. I'm going to say decides what to do with application after 10 days. I'm going to say yes is incomplete. So this decision, I'm saying yes, it's incomplete. Well, what makes it incomplete? It's incomplete when this application from the get 10-day app, the admission status, which is right here, equals incomplete app. And that's the only condition I need to put in here. And that is because I've already filtered out for online applications only. And I've already filtered out that the application is within this 10 days on using this pause element. So only applications that have a date incomplete less than or equal to today, minus 10. So within today, the 10 days of today. So that's already been filtered. So the only filter I need right here is just to make sure that my application is still incomplete. Okay, so now I'm going to connect this get record to my decision. And then now I need to say, okay, yes, this application is still incomplete. Now what? Okay, now I want it to just create a task. That's all I want it to do is just create a task for my counselor. So I'm going to drag out a create record. So create 10-day task, creates task for counselor. How many records do I want to create? Just one. And then I'm going to say I want to create a separate. So I'm going to say I want a task. And then this is where I literally define every single task field that I want to populate. So I'm going to start with the owner, which is the assigned to. And I can use, you can see all of the resources that have already started in my flow, I can access from here. It's considered a resource. So I'm going to say from my 10-day application, I want the owner, which is my counselor. I want to create a subject, which I'm going to just type in here and say day 10 incomplete app phone call. I have my owner, I have my subject, I have when do I want it to be due? I want it to be due, and if I want it to be due today, and today could be any day, whenever this flow happens to be triggered. So I'm going to create a new formula, which happens to just be called today formula, which is today's date. My data type is a date, and it's just today. And these are all resources that you can look up online, and when you use them enough, you'll start to remember some of the syntax. I'll click done. So now the activity date is today. There's a few other fields that I want to populate. I want to relate it to this application. So the related to, on the task is going to be the app from this 10 up. So I'm going to find the application ID, and that is what is going to be associated to this what ID, and I'll just click that. And then I want to put a status. So the status of this task is going to be not started, because it'll be assigned to the counselor for the first time, and they will be able to complete it once they're done. And that is all I need to do for this create task. I'm going to click done. So now I'm going to connect my decision to this task record, and I want it to happen whenever yes is done. So whenever it is still an incomplete app, it says, okay, yes, it is. Now what? Okay, create this task. And I'm going to click save. And up here at the top, you'll notice now I don't have any errors. If I were to say forget to connect any of these elements and I try to click save, it will allow me to save it, but it will give me a warning saying you have this issue. In this case, it's saying that my last create record right here, this create 10 task, is not connected to anything. And it'll give me a chance to be like, okay, I can go connect that, and then I click save, and you'll notice that the error is now gone. Okay, so now before I actually were to make it active, I would go through and debug it with an active record and go through that whole process. But I won't go through that now in the interest of time. So that's a very simple way to do a pause auto-launch flow. And if I wanted to have additional pause triggers, I can go in here and create additional, I could do 20 days, I could do 15 days, I could do whatever I wanted to here, and I could just go through and repeat these steps over and over again until I had the flow that I wanted.
Okay, that was a lot. That I say simple, and and it is simple once you start using it and get used to using it. So as I said when I introduced myself, I come from no technology background, but now I'm able to create these flows and use automation to solve a lot of business processes. So how did I get here? What are some of my best practices that I have? Start simple. Start by, as Anthony was demonstrating, pick something that you know what is expected and you know what the outcome is going to be, and start trying to use flow to solve some of these very simple business practices. If it's something that you're like, oh, a simple workflow, I'm used to it, I can just throw it in the workflow, just try it out in flow. Use your sandbox, create your sandbox, make sure your sandbox is ready to go. Use your sandbox to do anything. Anytime you're creating a new flow, anytime you're testing something, even making a minor change, always use your sandbox, because you never know what might happen. But try it out. Especially in a sandbox, it's okay if it doesn't work. It's okay if you get errors. It's okay if it doesn't do what you expected to do. Just start somewhere. Start somewhere simple. As you start getting into more complex flows, make sure you gather all of your requirements. I actually have a giant whiteboard that I use to map out some of these bigger flows, like this last one that I just showed you. It is kind of a series of repeating elements over and over again, but to get there, I wrote things down. I use Lucidchart, but I also use just a giant whiteboard that I have. And I definitely had my arrows and different colors going. And that's how it visually helped me see what was going on in my flow before I actually even started creating a new flow in my sandbox. I mapped it out and I tested it, and made sure, if anything unexpected was happening, which definitely there are some wonky things going on. So I have many iterations, but sandbox, test it, just keep trying, don't give up. If you have a question, if you don't know how to do something, Google it. Honestly, Google has helped me learn so much. And also it helps my brain not have to take up as much space with trying to remember some of these formulas like today and some of that syntax. And I can, because that's all stuff that I can look up. I can look it up on the Salesforce help. I can ask questions of the Salesforce community, which I definitely have done. If I'm facing an issue that I can't figure out, I know the answer's there, but I just can't figure it out. I throw the question out into the Salesforce community, and people are really good about, helping answer some of these questions. And definitely Google has, there's a lot of articles and resources out there. So research it. And as I said, just keep trying, just keep going. Don't get discouraged. There have been many times where, you get up, you walk around, but just keep trying it. Don't get discouraged. If you have a question, ask it. And people are more than happy to help out. So those are just some of how I got to be so comfortable with Flow. Is I just started. I just tried. I just started with something simple, as a simple field update. And once that worked, I started going into more and more details and looking into what is more, what are some of the more complicated business practices, and you just go from there. And before you know it, you're able to build, complicated flows. The key is document it, map it out, and test it in your sandbox before pushing it into production.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. That was super helpful and encouraging and impressive. So thanks again for your demonstration. So I think we have a few questions that maybe popped up through our presentation. So Anthony, I don't know if there's any of those you want to share, or I'll let you kind of turn it over to you if there are any questions that have come up.
Yes, so it seems like we have a few questions come up over here in the Q&A section. A couple of them have a similar theme, right? So we'll start off with the one from Teresa. Question is, do all current workflow rules need to be rebuilt into individual flows, or is there a way to convert them to a flow? Now, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. There were some murmurs somewhere in the Salesforce ecosystem that Salesforce may provide a conversion tool, but I am not 100% sure on that one.
Yeah, and there's nothing confirmed. That is the quote unquote rumor. I think certainly if they are requiring a change, they're going to provide some tools to assist. But this is an opportunity, I would say, to start to evaluate things holistically now and see where you can, take advantage of optimizing. Like as Anthony mentioned, you might have multiple workflow rules you can just put into one flow. And so there are some tools. I think there is also a few third-party kind of tools that might, that kind of proclaim you will convert it for you. You can probably do some Googling on that. I have not validated against that, but this is going to be a pretty hot topic in all Salesforce for the next year.
Mm-hmm. And then Teresa's comments, very similar to Marin's as well. So since there's still some time until this enforcement is supposedly going to take place, it's just good to just do it in Sandbox, right? Just as Stephanie was saying, if you have workflows, just do that, because we don't really know for sure what's going to happen. So you might as well just have them ready to go in your back pocket. So, and it's also a great practice tool as well.
One thing I would also just mention there, Anthony and Stephanie did a good job with the Sandbox piece as well, is you can deploy a flow from a sandbox to a production environment. So if you don't know what a change set is, essentially what it allows you to do is, instead of having to rebuild the flow from scratch in a production to match your sandbox, you can deploy it to your production after you validate it. So there is a process you can follow where, once you validate it against it, and then you can follow the deployment process, which is pretty straightforward.
All right, so this is a question that I may need your help on as well. So from Karen, we are asking, is there a way to build flows through ERX and flows through Pardot and not have an email sent on the same day? Or can you describe the difference between when you would set up a Pardot automation flow and when to set up a flow in ERX? For example, the incomplete app example that Stephanie was describing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's just depending on what marketing tool you're using. So a lot of clients use Pardot as an example that you shared. Some other clients might use Marketing Cloud or something like that. But it's just where you're wanting that communication to get sent. So all Stephanie's example was doing was showing the sending of email through Salesforce natively, not through Pardot. So it's just a business process decision. If you're wanting to, have those things kind of fire through Pardot. Pardot has engagement plans, which is a totally separate thing from Flow, but it kind of has a similar idea behind it. Where if you want a email to get sent and triggered from, the Salesforce instance directly, right? Kind of to replace some of the traditional workflow type of steps. As Stephanie shared, that can happen as well. And Stephanie, you can feel free to chime in on any of that additionally if you'd like.
Yes. So as I was building that flow, it's funny that you mentioned Pardot. I was thinking Pardot would be an excellent tool for this use case, especially for that incomplete app communication. Because as Matt was saying, Pardot has kind of those features already built in. It already has that spacing a little bit more user-friendly built in. Our instance of Pardot doesn't support a custom object, so it didn't support using the application information as the trigger, which is why I went with Flow in the first place. And also Flow gave me a little bit more flexibility just in terms of what other information I could pull in. So if I needed to pull in information from other objects, I would have been able to do that. But I did have it in the back of my mind that Pardot also could have been used for a similar communication flow to what I use the Salesforce flow for.
And just one last comment on that. The one advantage of using Pardot is that the tracking of engagement on like clickabilities in the email that's sent and like stats on email, reading and things like that are a lot more robust than Pardot than just native Salesforce. So that would be an argument for it, but there definitely is, evaluation process involved with that. All right, Anthony, any additional questions?
Yeah, so here's a really quick win here. So Lauren asks us, can we have more than one flow built per object without causing issues? And the answer is absolutely. So when we're building flows, different from Process Builder, we actually have like a list view kind of element where we could like make a flow list view of application flows where we put the name application in the label, right? There's a way where we can organize it, which definitely supports the fact that, yes, we can have multiple flows per object without causing issue. So, yeah. And then one more final comment. While you're getting used to building flows, I would encourage you probably to make a lot of small flows than to try to like force yourself into one big mega flow, right? Because it's easier to, troubleshoot the small individual ones, and it's going to help you as you're learning.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good tip.
Okay, let's see here. What else we got? I think we may have covered this before, but what is the timeline for process builders to become unused by Salesforce? Do we have a
we're not the official Salesforce spokespeople or anything like that. The rumor was that basically you want to think a year from now. No official announcements been made by Salesforce, but that's kind of the talk amongst the community. I'm sure they will have more communication coming out. But the takeaway is essentially you want to start thinking about it now, because even if it is a year away from now, just to get skilled up on feeling comfortable with building flow, starting to work in your sandboxes, and even if the deadline's down the line, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is just going to increase your efficiencies, right? With all your other processes, especially from just like a transactional element. So if you do run into issues with like DML exceptions or timeout errors, this greatly impacts that in a positive way. And, if you were looking for a place to start, where I would start would be those fast action flow workflow rules that Anthony mentioned, where you can look at, okay, I'm just making an update to the same object based on A to B. That's where I would start. I would just start with the very simple, they're very easy to build, or the easiest to build rather. And that's where I would start to look to make some of those transitions.
Very nice. Now this one I'm going to tap on to Stephanie. So I think we may have covered how we did this in your portion of the demo, but how would we maintain a very complex web of steps with a very complex flow, kind of like the one that you were showing with all the pauses? Is there a way to visualize the steps in a different way than a bunch of crisscross lines? Or is there a different way to do that just to ensure that we're not missing any steps along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where I prefer the freeform flow setup. I'm used to having to drag things onto the canvas. I'd been doing flow before that. Kind of auto setup was enabled for flow, but I recommend using the auto flow, especially the more complicated you get in a flow. That auto flow setup that Anthony had shown us makes the flow look a lot cleaner, and it makes it a lot easier to follow. I'm used to flow, so mine are kind of messy, and I'm not super proud of that. That's definitely an area that I can work on. But I also have my flows documented in kind of like a shared drive with our IT team, so that I can see what's supposed to happen at each step. And that's also where those descriptions really help out actually within the flow. Sometimes it's not a required field, but a description is always super helpful to know not just what the whole flow does, but also what individual element does within the flow.
Yeah, one other just comment on that, and this is a little bit more of an advanced feature, but is you can trigger something what's called a sub flow within flow. And so what that means is that if you have like a repeatable element that you're using over and over again, it can be its own flow that can be called from a parent flow. So in some examples where it gets very, very complex and it's triggering a lot, being able to just have that one kind of parent flow that shows what subflows it's firing simplifies it quite a bit. So that's not it's just starting out type of thing, but I know that some of the people I know that build a lot of complex flows utilize that quite a bit.
Good, very good. Okay, so I'm going to use a little bit of interpretation here, or maybe y'all can help me out. This question here, is there a node to indicate that the student ends or exits the flow? I feel like that's, not sure if that exists or not, but maybe the flow interview, is that what we're talking about perhaps?
So in this case, and it was really hard to tell in my flow because it was a lot of lines going everywhere, and it was kind of hard to see what each individual kind of pause element did. But the way I normally handle when a record kind of exits the flow is I literally just don't connect it to anything, and it just kind of stops. If I need to know that a record exits the flow, I will, I'll often do a create task and assign it to either myself or to a counselor. So that's a good kind of debugging step if you're not sure, what's going on and you need to know something happens at a particular time within the flow. Creating a record is a good way to kind of see what happens. For the flow to kind of do nothing, I just don't connect kind of that. You notice when I did my decisions, I connected the actual decision to something, but usually kind of that default, which is every other record that doesn't fit in my decision criteria, it's not connected to anything. So the flow just stops for those records at that point. And they just don't kind of continue forward there. So if you need to know that which records do that, then you can definitely create something to connect to those additional records. Otherwise, you don't need to connect it to anything, and those records just kind of stop. So for our incomplete applications, the next step is either they don't ever get completed or they get completed. Those are kind of the two options. And we have our completed apps kind of go off on their own separate way. Otherwise, it just kind of ends for those records.
Also, Matt, do you mind if I grab the screen share just to show something really quick? So if you're doing the auto layout, you actually have multiple different endpoints that are more visible, right? So in the flow that I'm showing right over here, if you had a decision element with different branches in auto layout, you'll see that we have the ends. It's right. It's a better visualization that the flow is doing quote unquote nothing. So that's just basically what I want to show you, that if you were doing auto layout, you see this, but if you were not doing auto layout, you know, like Stephanie was saying, it would just not be anything, right? It would just go nowhere. That's all I want to share.
Yeah. Very good.
All right, sorry, back to my Q&A. Let's see here. Okay, we have I think we have on our last questions here. So okay, I'm just going to interpret here. From a Screenflow prompt, a user to enter data to be stored in a field. So I'm thinking that we're asking that, can we have a Screenflow that forces the end user, the admissions counselor, to type in data that writes to the record that we're talking about? And I believe the answer is yes, right? With Screenflows, we have the ability to do multiple things, but at its simpler form, you could, yes, force your end users to type in specific data points if they're trying to perform a specific Screenflow. I don't know if I said that right, but yeah. And I think that's the end of our questions.
Very good. Yeah, and Stephanie was gracious enough to offer her own personal contact info here. So if you need to reach out to her, she gave the permission to do so. So feel free. This is her email address right here. And again, this recording will be shared, as well as the deck. One thing just to note is that we will have a survey at the end of the session. So please, we're about to wrap up here, but provide any feedback. It really helps us as we plan more of these to aid you as our client base. Really helps us kind of tailor those to your needs. So we have our EnrollmentRx kind of a RAD navigator, which has all our documentation and things like that. But the main thing I wanted to highlight here is that if you're looking to get started in Flow, Trailhead, again, is the Salesforce resource. If you not set that up, I highly recommend you do that. But what's great about Trailhead is they have what are called dev sandboxes, which are specific to your Trailhead account. Has zero to do with your school, right? So if you're trying to just learn Flow, mess it up, just get the concepts down, you're able to do that. So like this one, for example, build a simple flow is a project where you'd be able to go in and in that sandbox and build a flow safely without worrying about breaking anything. And then you can start to get those concepts, and then, as Stephanie said, start to build those in your sandbox and so forth. So highly recommend you start to go through some of these flows on Trailhead. There's other great resources outside of Trailhead as well, but this is definitely a great and safe place to start. So with that, we want to really thank everybody for attending our webinar today. Hopefully it kind of opened your eyes a little bit to what can be done with Flow and the next steps as we go through this journey together. And thanks again, extra thank you to Stephanie for her time and sharing all her knowledge. So thanks everybody. We hope you have a great rest of the day and late fall. Thanks so much.